Yes, no problem at all. It's a pleasure.
Cadê? Olá, boa noite a todos. Estamos aqui com o professor Edward Watts, da Universidade da Califórnia, campus de San Diego. Be welcome, Professor Edward Watts, at California University, San Diego. We are very happy because you accepted our invitation. Thank you very much. And we are going to start reading the CV of Professor Edward Watts, and I'm going to call Barbara, my student of doctorate, to do the reading now. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Margot. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Professor. So now I shall proceed to Professor's introduction. Let's begin. Professor Edward Watts received his PhD in history from Yale University 2002. His research interests center on the intellectual and religious history of the Roman Empire and the early Byzantine Empire. His first book, City and School in Late Antique Athens and Alexandria, University of California Press, 2006, explains how the increasingly Christian upper class of late antique Rome used a combination of economic and political pressures to neutralize pagan elements of the traditional educational system. City and School received the Outstanding Publication Award from the Classical Association of the Middle West and South in 2007. His second book, Riot in Alexandria, Historical Debate in Pagan and Christian Communities, University of California Press, 2010, uses Greek, Latin, Coptic, and Syriac sources to reconstruct an Alexandrian riot that erupted in 48-6 AD. Riot received a 2010 Prose Award honorable mention in classics and ancient history. His third book, The Final Pagan Generation, University of California Press, 2015, offers a generational history of the men born in the 310s that traces the experience of living through the 4th century's dramatic religious and political changes. It was awarded the 2015 Phi Alpha Theta Best Subsequent Book Prize. His fourth book, Hypatia, The Life and Legend of an Ancient Philosopher, Oxford University Press, 2017, recounts the life of an important female philosopher whose work redefined philosophy and whose death resonated as a symbol of dramatic religious and social change in the early 5th century. He's also the author of Mortal Republic, How Rome Fell into Tyranny, Basic Books, 2018, and also The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome, Oxford, 2022. Professor Edward Watts is currently Alcibiades Vassiliadis Endowed Chair and Professor of History at University of California, San Diego, and Professor of Classics at Tri-Campus Classics Program. Professor, again, be very welcome, and now the floor is yours.
So I want to begin by just thanking you, Barbara, for such a wonderful introduction, and thanking Margot and Andrea for inviting me and for making this possible, and then also for Pedro and Felipe for making the backstage streaming possible. So I want to start with some slides, if I can present those. So the talk that I want to give today is something that grows out of a particular set of interests that I have as someone who lives on the border between the United States and Mexico. And as someone who resides in a border area, one of the things that's particularly intriguing to me is the way in which people can inhabit this space that straddles two very different places and two very different countries, and create identities that are individual and unique to themselves, but also are identities that have many different aspects of the place they came from featured in different contexts. And I think one of the most important things that we can do as ancient historians is find a way to use our understanding of the past to help us better explain some of the conditions that we see in the world around us. And I think this is particularly true in a context like that of San Diego and Tijuana, or in other multicultural societies. And Brazil, of course, is a wonderful example of this. What the ancient world shows us is how people with very different backgrounds can come together and find places for themselves in very different settings, in a way that might not superficially make a lot of sense to us, but to the people involved makes a great deal of sense. And so I want to begin by turning our attention to the city of Athens. When we think of the geography of the city of Athens, there are three tall hills that frame the ancient core of the city. The first of these is, of course, the flat area, the flat plateau on which the Athenian Acropolis and the Parthenon sit. The second of these is the steep peak of Lycabettos, which is now recognizable by the beautiful white Christian church that's perched atop the hill. But modern visitors largely ignore the third hill, the Museion Hill, that rises southwest of the Acropolis. So this is the view of the Museion Hill, and you can see the Acropolis and Lycabettos over on the right. And then this is the Museion Hill from the Odeon of Herodotus Atticus. Now, the Museion Hill is a wonderful space that offers panoramic views of the Acropolis, Piraeus, Salamis, and on a clear day, Megara and Corinth. These views enchant the few tourists who make the climb to the top of that hill. But even these intrepid sightseers usually ignore the ruins that cap the peak. These belong to a tall funeral monument set up around the year 116 AD to honor Gaius Julius Antiochus Philopappos. Philopappos claimed many identities during his life, and each of these identities might seem irreconcilable to a 21st century observer. Philopappos was the descendant of one of the last kings of the great Seleucid royal house. He was also an Athenian citizen who paid the expenses for all the Athenian tribes competing in a choral competition. And he was a Roman senator who served as consul in the year 109. His funerary monument advertises all three of these identities. It also does very little to explain what, aside from the person of Philopappos himself, could coherently unite these distinctive Roman, Athenian, and Hellenistic royal aspects of his life. Philopappos' monument stood within the Athenian city limits on some of the most visually arresting real estate available. And it was a significant concession to allow this to be erected because the Athenians had effectively prevented burials from within their city walls for centuries. The monument itself sits on a square base that supports a multi-story semicircular superstructure, as well as the tomb in which Philopappos was buried. There are two levels of sculptural relief that you can see on this reconstruction. The lower relief shows a figure wearing a toga and a tunic standing in a chariot that's drawn by 4 horses. In front of this figure are 6 lictors holding the consular fasces. This is then a Roman scene that depicts Philopappos in Roman garb and represents the moment when he assumed the consulship. On the second level, one sees Philopappos in a different fashion. This is Philopappos depicted nude from the waist up, with his lower level covered by a Greek hemation, an iconography that evokes Greek heroes. 2 of Philopappos' ancestors flanked him. On one side is Philopappos' grandfather, Antiochus IV, who is the last king of Commagene and is enthroned like a Hellenistic king, but wearing a Roman toga to mark his submission to Roman power. On the other side of Philopappos once stood a statue of Seleucus Nicator, a more distant ancestor who was the founder of the Seleucid dynasty. There can be no doubt that the central figure on each level represents Philopappos. Philopappos, the Greek hero, sits directly above Philopappos, the Roman consul, separated only by a Greek inscription that identifies Philopappos and his Athenian deme. Two other inscriptions on the sides of Philopappos' portrait also identify him, each using a different sort of inscription and a different formulation to describe his position and his ancestry. To the viewer's right, there was once a Greek inscription that read, King Antiochus Philopappos, the son of Epiphanes, the son of Antiochus. This is the same man with the same ancestors, but all of them are now framed in ways that advertise Philopappos' Hellenic royal lineage. And then to his left is another inscription, this time in Latin, that reads, Gaius Julius Antiochus Philopappos, the son of Gaius of the Fabian tribe, consul, Arval brethren, admitted to the Praetorian rank by the Emperor Caesar, Nerva, Trajan, Optimus, Augustus, Germanicus, Daciacus. This again is the same Philopappos, but he and his father are both now identified using their Roman legal names. Philopappos himself is further defined by his Roman voting tribe, the Fabian tribe, his Roman cultic service as one of the Arval brethren, and the privileged social status that Trajan granted to him. Now, modern scholars have struggled to explain how the diverse components of this monument fit together. One even called it an iconographical nightmare. But an ancient viewer wouldn't have been confused at all. This was Philopappos as he saw himself. He was simultaneously Hellenistic royalty, an Athenian citizen and benefactor, and a Roman consul and priest. All of these markers of status defined him in specific contexts, but none defined him all the time. When he attended the Senate, for example, Philopappos would wear a toga and be referred to by his Roman legal name. It would be the height of arrogance and maybe even seditious to refer to him as King Antiochus Philopappos in a Roman senatorial context. It would also make no sense to speak about his Athenian deme, but it would be equally inappropriate for Philopappos to refer to himself as a king or consul when he presided over an Athenian choral competition. In that context, only his deme and his Athenian nomenclature were appropriate to mention. The other identifiers were either irrelevant or potentially even offensive. Only Philopappos the man served as the vessel that unified these diverse aspects of his person. This monument commemorated Philopappos by showcasing his Roman, Athenian, and Hellenistic royal identities, because one could not disregard any of those identities without disregarding an essential part of who Philopappos was. So this monument suggests a new way to consider the dynamic between Greek and Roman identities in the High Roman Imperial period. It's of course rather difficult for us to see if people who identify as Romans, when we are separated from them by more than 2 millennia. But we must also contend with the loss not only of their voices, but of most of the material remains of their lives. And even the material that we do possess is sometimes difficult to properly interpret. How, for example, does one understand Aelius Aristides' evident pride in his Roman citizen status, his Greek cultural heritage, and his status as one of Smyrna's most popular and prominent residents? And how does Aristides' view of his Romanitas compare to that of his contemporary, Julianus the Zagrentian, a Moroccan tribal chieftain who was given citizenship by the emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus as a reward for his service to Rome? Both Aelius Aristides and Julianus shared Roman status, but it's likely that it didn't mean the same thing to either one of them. This is because Aristides, Julianus, and millions of other Romans paired their Romanitas with other non-Roman identities. Aristides, for example, embraced both his connection to Rome and to his home region of Asia Minor. And despite his Roman citizenship, Julianus and his family continued to live and be governed by the local customs of the Zagrentian community to which they belonged. Philopappus's iconographic nightmare of a tomb points to a significant historical challenge, because in antiquity as today, people can have multiple identities that they embrace and express in ways that might look contradictory to an outsider. But to that particular individual, these identities are not contradictory at all. So as scholars of Chicano history in the United States have shown, it's perfectly natural for someone who is in California to be of Mexican heritage and to say that he is both American and Mexican. He considers himself no less American if he speaks Spanish, if he roots for the Mexican World Cup team, or he eats Oaxacan food. And he's no less Mexican if he litigates a lawsuit using US law, wears an LA Dodgers hat, or votes in a US election. Similarly, a figure like Julianus could proudly display his grant of Roman citizenship in a beautifully carved Latin inscription erected in a city bath complex, while also maintaining his traditional status as his Agrentian leader. But an outsider with an incomplete picture of this person's activities might miss one of those identities. We know one way in which Julianus expressed his Romanitas, but we have little idea of how exactly he continued to express his Agrentian identity. At the same time, neither identity is false or contrived. Both are as real and historically notable as that of a Californian of Mexican descent. This is the message that Philopappus was sending. And it's also a message that we can see reflected in different forms by Philopappus's friend, the famous biographer and philosopher Plutarch of Chaeronea. Plutarch, a Boeotian Greek who possessed both Roman and Athenian citizenship and held a priesthood at Delphi, advertised these identities in a fashion that is both more nuanced and less clearly discerned than that of Philopappus. And this has much to do with the immense quantity and diversity of Plutarch's writings. Perhaps 1/3 of what he once published still survives, but these extant works still take up more than 30 volumes in the Loeb Classical Library. As Leva van Hoof has argued, Plutarch's works offered elites in Italy and the Greek world a platonically infused set of moral principles that helped them to control their passions and philosophically regulate their behaviors. In a literary career that stretched across 6 decades, Plutarch wrote philosophical treatises, antiquarian works, essays on practical ethics, a collection of biographies of Roman emperors, and the Parallel Lives, the most famous project in which he paired biographies of 2 Greek and Roman figures whose characters Plutarch judged to be similar. One theme becomes clear across all of this diversity. Plutarch used these works to claim for himself a specific sort of cultural and social status as a leading philosophical authority within a circle of educated Italian and Hellenic Romans who shared an affinity for Greek culture. Much of this grew out of the personal connections that Plutarch had with leading Romans. He was born in 45 AD in the Greek city of Chaeronea and studied in Athens under the Platonist Ammonius in the later 60s. He and Ammonius both attended the games at Delphi, where the Emperor Nero performed in 68, and he may have served as part of an embassy that greeted the Emperor Vespasian's assertion of imperial power in 69. At some point in the late 60s or early 70s, Plutarch met the senator Lucius Mestrius Florus, the patron through whom he would secure Roman citizenship. Now, Plutarch never mentions this Roman citizenship in his surviving works, but it's known from a dedicatory inscription erected in Delphi that marks him as Mestrius Plutarch the priest, an indication of Plutarch's blending of Hellenic and Roman self-representations. Plutarch first traveled to Rome in the 70s, and he apparently met up with Florus, traveled around Italy with him, and then began giving philosophical lectures to Florus's friends. Although the lectures were in Greek, Plutarch evidently knew enough Latin, and he could use his time in the capital to conduct historical research. So he read extensively from the works of authors like Cicero and Varro, and the visit encouraged him to begin work on the lives of the Caesars, a long set of Greek language biographies of the Roman emperors that commenced with Augustus and ended with the death of the Emperor Vitellius. He also likely drafted a declamation entitled On the Fortune of the Romans during this period. Now, these works show Plutarch's great interest in Rome and its histories, but the lives of the Caesars particularly reflected the concerns of a philosophically inclined, Greek-speaking Roman looking to make a distinctive statement about the just government of the empire. The basic project in the Caesars consisted of profiling the character of past rulers in ways that emphasize how well these rulers succeeded in ruling according to the philosophical principles of self-control and justice. The work also advertised Plutarch's role as a possible guide for Romans who sought to develop these traits in themselves. Plutarch wrote as a Roman, addressing other Romans about their shared history, but he did this in a fashion that simultaneously highlighted his distinct Greek philosophical background. And as Plutarch's career progressed, he became ever more adept at presenting himself simultaneously as a Roman insider and a Greek outsider, who offered practical advice and moral training to a Roman audience based on Hellenic philosophical principles. Plutarch made at least 2 more trips to Rome in the 80s and early 90s AD, continuing to give lectures and offer his instruction to senators in person, much as he'd done in the 70s. But the change in political climate following the murder of the Emperor Domitian in September of 96 AD also prompted a shift in Plutarch's literary projects. 2 series of texts addressed to or featuring prominent Roman senators or of provincial origin began to appear around the time of Nerva's accession. The first of these consisted of a set of works focused on practical ethics that might guide elite behavior in appropriately philosophical ways. Dedications to the consuls Fundanus and our friend Philopappos show that Plutarch directed this work specifically to men who straddled the Greek and Roman worlds during the reign of Trajan. A passage in On Feeling Good, one of the works that mentions Fundanus, even speaks directly to the new Trajanic context in which Greeks from the East could aspire to the consulship. This passage chastises those who are never satisfied with the honors that they have earned. And so Plutarch writes, some who enjoy prominence in local Greek cities complain that they do not wear senatorial shoes. If they do, they complain that they are not Roman praetors. If they are praetors, they complain that they are not yet consuls. If they are consuls, they complain that they were named last and not first. Now, this last comment refers to a desire to serve as consul ordinarius, one of the 2 men who gave their names to a year in the Roman calendar. And it means that these are figures, Greek figures, who could aspire to the office of consul ordinarius. This is particularly remarkable because no Greek had held an ordinary consulship until the year 105 AD. And so this particular anxiety among Greeks about achieving the consul ordinarius status must first have arisen in the Trajanic period. So these ethical works then rebranded Plutarch as an authority for how one could practically apply Platonic philosophy to a Trajanic world where the aspirations of elite Greeks and Romans had rapidly converged. The second great project that Plutarch embarked upon after Trajan's accession was the Parallel Lives. And this work, Plutarch's most famous project, was published in stages, beginning with an initial series of lives pairing prominent Greek figures with leaders of the Roman royal and republican past. These works were dedicated to Trajan's close friend, Quintus Sosius Senecio, probably on the occasion of Senecio's consulship in 99 AD. The initial response to the project seems to have been extremely positive, and Plutarch continued adding pairs of lives for more than 2 decades. All told, at least 23 pairs appeared between 98 AD and Plutarch's death early in the reign of Hadrian. While each pair of lives is distinctive, they were all joined by Plutarch's overarching notion that one needed to use the tools of philosophy in order to develop the ability to control one's passions through reason. Both this ambition and the tools Plutarch advised using were originally Greek. What Plutarch emphasized that the city of Rome's greatest achievements came at the time when it made Greek learning and all forms of educational training its own. And so the Roman Empire to which Plutarch belonged did best when it drew upon the best moral training from all of its constituent parts, especially those parts that came from the Greek world. So the parallel lives then represented a philosophically infused attempt to make usable the shared Greek and Roman historical legacies that Romans like Plutarch could claim as their own. The parallel lives saw both Greek and Roman historical materials as integral to this project of moral exploration. But Plutarch does not attempt to hybridize these two distinct traditions or the figures who play a prominent role in them. Both Roman and Greek exemplars mattered to Plutarch, and by extension, to the audience of cultivated Romans like Senecio that he's trying to reach, because both of those historical traditions were very much his own. They have no inherent unity, but they are unified in the person of the narrator who paired them and in the cultural universe within which that narrator bases his moral instruction. This was, in a sense, a new, practical, and usable history suitable for men like Senecio, Philopappos, and Fundanus, the very sort of elite Romans of provincial origin that the Trajanic Empire was creating. And Plutarch's insight was that the presentation of the past as the sum of the virtuous and vicious actions of singular individuals made Greek and Roman history mutually intelligible as a source of moral instruction. It also pointed towards the sorts of behaviors that Roman elites of all cultural origins could imitate in order to make the Greco-Roman present and future function according to the moral traditions and teachings of Greek philosophy. Now, Philopappos and Plutarch give us different ways of displaying a figure's distinctive, overlapping, but not competing Greek and Roman identities in the early Antonine period. A younger Antonine era figure, the historian Appian, undertook a unique literary project that defined how this Roman Empire of many different peoples developed. Appian's background is quite interesting. He was born in Alexandria around the year 95 AD, and he died in Rome around 165. He lived in Egypt until the year 117 AD, when he fled as Jewish rebels inspired by Simon of Cyrene threatened the city of Alexandria. And like Plutarch, Appian wrote in Greek, but he read Latin and he held Roman citizenship. Like Philopappos, he also held imperial office. In Appian's case, this consisted of a procuratorship he held during the reign of Antoninus Pius, and there's also epigraphic evidence that he held a priesthood in the capital. So like Philopappos and Plutarch, Appian very much belongs in this Antonine world where Greek elites entered the highest levels of Roman political and social life. Now, the biographical references that we have to Appian's life provide us with a rough sense of the career of a man whose provincial origins, Greek language, and Roman honors all remain parts of a complicated and layered identity that Appian believed many of his contemporaries shared. The very first sentence of Appian's Roman history reveals the author's interest in tracing how Roman expansion created a state that joined together many different peoples without requiring them to abandon their historical distinctiveness. Since I intend, Appian states, to begin writing the history of the Romans, I believe it's necessary to delineate the geographical boundaries of the people, the ethnon, the Romans govern, arkusi. The two concepts introduced here, the concept of ethnos and the concept of arche, are going to define the parameters of Appian's entire history and also define his understanding of the multicultural world that he inhabits. So Appian explains that his goal in the text is to understand the character of each ethnos by describing the actions of the Romans towards each one, with the result that I may learn the weakness or power of the ethne and the excellence or power of those who took them over. Appian wrote the part relating to each ethne separately, until those ethnic groups are incorporated into the Roman Empire, the arche. But once the Roman conquest of Egypt makes the arche complete, Appian completely changes the structure of his narrative. It stops being an ethnographic one, in which each book is devoted to the history of an ethnos as it's conquered and incorporated into the Roman state, and then it becomes a completely different kind of story. Once the conquest of the empire the conquest of Egypt makes the empire complete, the structure becomes a chronological one. And it moves chronologically and outlines the conditions of the empire in the imperial period through Appian's own day. And then he concludes the work with a final book that outlines the conditions of the arche, the Roman Empire, in Appian's own day, by describing things like the present military force of the Romans and the resources that they enjoy from each ethnos. And so the geographically diffuse series of mini histories then ends with a more conventional linear narrative of the Roman state after Augustus that focused on the empire as a collective entity. And so Appian saw Roman history as a progression through which a particular ethnos or region became part of the Roman arche. So for example, the third book is about the Samnite ethne, against whom the Romans fought for 80 years under the greatest difficulties before they finally subjugated them and their neighboring ethne. It's named the Samnitica of the Romans, Romaiakon Samnitike, in order to emphasize that the story of the Samnites is linked to the wider story and to the wider arche to which they're forcibly joined. The order of the books also reflects this teleology of eventually becoming part of a Roman arche. So each of these books, Appian writes, will be organized in relation to each other according to when the Romans started each war, although the end of the ethne occurs after many other things. Now, Appian's discussion of Italy in particular shows that he does not mean that an ethnos becomes extinct when it's joined to the Roman arche. So the end that he's talking about is more a teleological end than a sort of final and absolute endpoint. Italy, Appian wrote, had the most of all of the ethne, including the ethnos of the Romans themselves. So in his discussion of the humiliating aftermath of the Samnite victory of a Roman army at Caudine Forks in 321 BC, Appian records Samnite leaders debating what to do with the captured Roman soldiers. He says they spoke about how a response that was too brutal would take away from the two ethne, meaning the Samnites and the Romans, all hope of mutual accommodation by doing an irreparable wrong, while a fair treaty would establish peace between the two ethne. So this shows that in Appian's view, the Romans are an ethnos all to themselves. Appian also, though, explains why the nature of the Roman arche permits so many different ethne to exist within a political structure. I mean, he does this in his discussion of the social war. Now, the social war, as I'm sure many of us know, broke out in the late 90s BC, in large part because a group of Italian allies were refused Roman citizenship by the Roman state. And so it's a very peculiar war because the solution actually is greater incorporation. That's what the revolution that's launched is about. And so Appian, when he's explaining the civil war or the social war, he said that the social war broke out among the many ethne of Italy because two generations of Roman politicians excited Italians to desire Roman citizenship so that they would share in leadership rather than being subjects. Appian then mentions the contrast between the people subject to Rome and those who participated in leading its state 3 times in his narrative of the lead up to the social war. So the first of these concerned a failed proposal of Flavius Flaccus to extend citizenship in 125 BC. The next one occurred in 121 BC after the murder of Gaius Gracchus, when Appian reports that Italians could no longer tolerate being subjects instead of equals. And then finally, Livius Drusus promised the Italians that he would bring forward a new law to give them citizenship. And they especially desired this because by that one step, they would become rulers instead of subjects. Instead of this law taking effect, Livius Drusus was assassinated and Italy erupted in chaos. And the initial spark came when Roman visitors to the Italian city of Asculum were killed by locals. And Appian wrote that this happened, and when it did, when the revolt broke out, all of the ethne around Asculum declared war at the same time. Despite the violence, these ethne around Asculum sent ambassadors to Rome to remind the Senate that they had all worked together with the Romans to build the arche, the empire. But the Romans didn't deem their helpers worthy of citizenship, meaning participation, full participation in that arche. In Appian's telling, the tensions causing the social war grew out of a fundamental Roman misunderstanding about what their empire, their arche, actually was. Appian believed that their arche, the Roman Empire, was a collective achievement of a group of ethne, Romans included, but not Romans exclusively, that created a political superstructure joining all of the people in that arche together in a common enterprise, but did not eliminate the features that made each ethnos distinctive. And so Appian makes clear that the social war ended when Romans recognized this fact. He says, at first, the Romans, fearing that the Etruscans and the Umbrians and other neighboring them were all excited to revolt, voted to make citizens of the Italian allies who were still loyal, which all of them most desired. And they sent this decree around to the Etruscans who gladly accepted citizenship. Then the Romans progressively extended citizenship to more and more of the peninsula until the whole of Italy came into the Roman Politeia. That's the word Appian uses. These Italian ethne did not cease to exist after their members became Roman citizens. Instead, they remained fully distinctive ethne, fully integrated into both the Roman arche and the Roman political structure that governed that arche. So Appian's description of his own identity places him comfortably within a Roman arche like the one he describes following the social war. This was an empire that offers citizenship and positions of leadership to members of the ethne that comprise it without compelling anybody to abandon their ethnic identity. Appian describes his background in the preface to his massive work as follows. He says, "I'm Appian, the Alexandrian, a man who reached the first rank in his homeland and pleaded cases in Rome before the emperors until they judged me worthy of being their procurator. At the same time, Appian also writes with evident pride about the immense resources that people he calls my kings, the Ptolemies, possessed after the breakup of the empire of Alexander the Great. Although Appian frames himself as both an Egyptian native and a Roman official in his history, he assumed a different pose in the most personal surviving reference to his career. This is found on a sarcophagus that now serves as a storage bin for gardening tools in the Vatican. It contains 2 columns of Greek elegiac distiches that commemorate Appian and Eutychia, his wife of 31 years. These lines mention neither Appian's Alexandrian origins nor his procuratorship. Instead, they define him as, quote, holding the honor of a priesthood of all golden Rome's Tyche through the king of Ausonian might. And this is a probable reference to one of the 12 priesthoods of the cult of Rome and Venus that was centered on the double temple at the end of the Roman Forum built by Hadrian. And here you can see the temple. These lines also celebrate Appian's devotion to his wife, who was buried alongside him. And so the portrait of a devoted priest and husband, it seems, was the public identity that Appian most wanted people in Rome to remember. So in the end, Appian offers us a neat parallel to the Philopapos monument with which we began. Like Philopapos, Appian was simultaneously a pious Roman, a proud, connected person to the Greek Hellenic tradition, and an imperial official. So Appian himself was a pious Roman priest of the cult of Venus in Rome. He was a proud Alexandrian native. He was an author who wrote in Greek. And he was a prominent Roman official serving in the capital. Like Philopappus and Plutarch, Appian simply chose which of those identities to invoke depending upon the context in which he found himself. These choices didn't make Appian any more or less Roman or Alexandrian or Egyptian. They instead simultaneously affirmed his place among the various groups that made up the Roman Empire and his role among the citizen leaders of the Roman state. Millions of people across hundreds of years have shared this experience. And it's important that we who live in diverse societies, societies that incorporate lots of people with lots of different backgrounds, but also create a space in which it's possible to embrace where you came from and also where you are. It's important that we recognize that this process, this struggle, this desire to be all of these different aspects of our identity at once, this is not a new struggle. This is a struggle that has existed for more than 2,000 years. And it's a struggle that we can turn to the ancient and early medieval world to help us understand and to help us function better in societies that are as complicated and diverse as some of the great societies in antiquity. So I thank you very much for this, and I'm happy to turn things back to the organizers.
Please, could you repeat?
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part.
Are you listening to us, Edward? No?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah. Could you repeat, please? Margot didn't listen to you. What you said. Did you finish, or would you like to know about time? You finished.
If there's any questions or anything that people want to ask, I'm happy to do that.
Let's check the chat, Margot, right? To see if there are any questions.
Oh, okay.
Let me see. There isn't any yet, but we can take a time to see if anybody is gonna ask something.
First, I would like to thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. Very interesting for all of us. We start studying identity construction in Brazil after 2000 with the book with the companion of Janet Huskinson, Experiencing Rome, and we developed our subjects about it in our research. And in nowadays, I have a student who is she's beginning to study Plutarch. And I'd like to hear from you a little more about the philosophical Greek background of Plutarch, if you don't mind to develop a little bit more about it, because I'd like to help her more.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that one of the challenges that we have in talking about the philosophical background of Plutarch is he comes in this moment where Platonism has become decentralized. So in the Old Academy and the Middle Academy, you went to Athens to study Platonism. And in late antiquity, you went to Athens or Alexandria to study Platonism. And at the time of Plutarch, there are lots of places that you can study Platonism. And so one of the things that does is it opens space for people who are not directly connected to the Athenian Platonic school to serve as authoritative teachers. Because in a sense, no one is controlling the tradition in this period of what we call Middle Platonism. And so Plutarch studies in Athens, probably under a man named Ammonius, who is a Platonist, but there isn't one school in Athens that controls kind of the orthodoxy of Platonic teaching. And so when Plutarch goes to Rome and starts saying, I am a Greek intellectual, but I can speak to Roman senators about how they can incorporate Greek philosophical ideas in their practices, he's able to do this because, in a sense, there isn't a figure in Athens who's in charge who can say, no, that's not right. So it's a very interesting moment where I think we can see Plutarch as a kind of intellectual entrepreneur who is building an intellectual brand that gives him prominence and makes him quite a bit of money, in large part because there isn't a centralized institution in control of Platonism at that moment. So yeah, so I guess I would say that what you can see in Plutarch is a kind of eclectic Platonism, but it's very typical of the late 1st and early 2nd century AD.
Platonismo eclético.
Yes. Okay, I got it. Thank you very much. Wonderful. It's amazing. I thought about it, but now I'm sure we are in a good way, in a very interesting way. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful moment to study Platonism. And one of the figures that would be very interesting to study alongside Plutarch in that moment is Apuleius. Because with Apuleius, you have a similar sort of moment of a figure with training, but also the ability to go to a different location and use that training to build his own identity, build his own career.
Oh, yes. She started studying Herodotus, and not because she's very interested about the figure of Pythia, and she's going to develop it now with Plutarch, and she would like to construct a relation about between Plutarch and Herodotus, okay? And I'm helping her to do the project. This is the reason I did this kind of question for you.
No, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful project.
Thank you very much. Okay, because my study is about Emperor Julian. I have studied Emperor Julian for a long time. The documents from Emperor Julian and the others who talked about Emperor Julian. And I suppose Emperor Julian is a kind of mistura de.
It's a mixture of.
It's a mixture of Greek elements and Roman elements. To study his identity is very interesting too, and he wrote everything. He wrote everything in Greek, but I use it to guide my students in many kinds of subjects.
This is true.
In Principate and late antiquity.
And
no,
also,
I think Julian is the culmination of this, because in Julian you have, the Greek philosopher who is 100% a legitimate Greek philosopher, who also is the Roman emperor, right? When you blend Greek philosophy in Roman imperial power, you cannot do it any more than Julian did. And, I think what you have there is the moment where this whole process really culminates in a figure who, is even more so a hybrid of these traditions than, say, someone like Marcus Aurelius, who, of course, Julian is modeling himself on.
Okay, it's amazing. I did a lecture in this conference for some people, of course, and now I study the relation of Euribalsius and Emperor Julian, and I talked about this kind of characteristic of Emperor Julian. He's hybrid. He's hybrid.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm very happy because my ideas are going to meet your point of view.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I think it's wonderful.
Okay.
Let's check the chat, Margot, to see if there.
Yes.
Professor Andrea told me she would like to ask something, but I don't know if she's here with us. Yeah. Pedro, are you there? Could you confirm it to me? She's here.
She's Andrea.
Andrea, if you want,
Andrea,
please.
você quer fazer alguma pergunta a ele, Andrea?
Sim. First, your presentation is great. Was great, Professor Edward Eddie.
Thank you.
I'm research about Trajano, and about Pliny the Younger, and Dio of Prusa. And when you talk about Plutarch, I thought about the intellectuals, like your presentation, and I research about this intellectual, like a network of literature to build the image of the emperors. And Trajan is the first emperor of another line of out the Italic space. Do you think that these intellectuals are the mainly network to build that the inclusion of the people or the other people in Rome in the first century? Because we can read a lot of people that they build the image of the other, and the Italian of the other, and the Roman. And I think your presentation can show us and think more about this thesis. The network, or the network of the intellectuals, Roman or not Roman, in building this image in the new emperor in the first century. Understand me, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it's a wonderful point, and I think the thing. So I'm right now working on a project that looks at the construction and the evolution of Romans living in a Roman state from 8th century BC to 1453 AD. And so this project is coming out of that very big project. But what I noticed in that is that a lot of the people who become prominent for this kind of activity under Trajan actually started under Domitian. And Trajan himself is, elevated to the position that allows him to become emperor because of the service that he rendered to Domitian in putting down a rebellion. And so I think when you look at these figures who come to prominence under Trajan, people like Pliny, people like Suetonius, people like Plutarch, what you see is these are figures who actually become prominent under the Flavians. And a lot of them become prominent under Domitian. So Pliny, for example, really gets his start because of Domitian. Suetonius gets his start because of Domitian. And it's after Domitian's death that all of these people, including Trajan, have to redefine themselves. And so I think when you look at Trajan, I think we have to see Trajan as a creature of the late 80s and early 90s, where all of these people who are of provincial backgrounds are becoming really prominent because Domitian is reorganizing the Roman Senate so that there are these people from the provinces. So the first Greek consuls are under Domitian. The elevation of people like, especially Suetonius from North Africa, or Pliny from sort of provincial Italy, this happens under Domitian because what Domitian is doing is sidelining a lot of the people who were the old Italian elites of the Republic to build a new ruling aristocracy. And when Trajan comes in, it's already built for him. And all he does is he lets this sort of process take its natural course and creates the kind of Antonine aristocracy. But it wasn't Trajan's idea to do this. Trajan himself was a creation of the process, and he understood what was going on, why it was important, and he kept doing it. But Domitian is the one who I really think should get the credit for making possible what we see in the early 100s, because these are his people that he chose. And Trajan just gets the advantage of being able to use them after Domitian is gone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the answer. I think we have a question, Margot, Barbara. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pedro asked something. Let's read it, please. Let me see on here. So he says, first of all, congratulations from this presentation. My question is linked to the term identity in your presentation. In Brazil, the identity question is very important. And my question is, how do you see the importance of studying of Greek and Roman societies studies and their history on this Latin identity perspective?
Yeah, so I think, so I guess the Latin identity in antiquity or the Latin identity sort of in a modern context?
Pedro, did you catch his question? Yes, so please tell us. Or maybe it is
Latin America, yeah. So, so this is a project that I'm very, very interested in. We have some colleagues at UNAM in Mexico City that we're working on with this as well. It's very interesting, again, as somebody who lives 20 kilometers from the border, it's very interesting to see how the classical tradition in Northwestern Europe and in the Northern United States is different from the way that it exists in Latin America. Specifically, I mean, I know the Spanish Latin America better, but the idea of ancient identity and the 16th and 17th and 18th century questions of identity in places like Lima or Mexico City, it's very different in that identity is something that is, antiquity is very much alive in the worlds and the intellectual traditions and the sort of culture of people working in like the University of Lima in the 16th century or working in Mexico City in the 18th century, in a way that it isn't in, say, Boston or New York. So I think there's something quite interesting in the idea in Latin America that the classics exists in a kind of unbroken way with the present. And it's totally natural for an author working in the 17th century in northern Mexico to write an ethnographic history that takes the same form as something from antiquity and actually uses some of the same terms and ideas as something from antiquity. That isn't really done in, in the English-speaking colonies in places like Massachusetts. And so I think when we're looking at identities connected to antiquity in places like Latin America, I think those identities are quite real, and they continue to form. They continue to form and reform as modern Latin American countries and modern Latin American societies develop. And I think that they're a living tradition in a way that they are not so much a living tradition in places like New England or England itself or France. So I think there's something quite interesting there. The second part of that is, I think, in diverse societies, the question of identity as it was understood by somebody like Appian is actually in some ways very modern, because it allows you to be multiple things at once, and it allows you to choose when a particular identity is most useful for you to deploy. So, if, again, using the example of someone in California, I wasn't born in California. There are aspects of my identity that are very different from California. And there are moments where asserting that identity is useful, and there are moments where asserting that identity is inappropriate. That's a very ancient way of thinking as well. And so I think that also has some relevance to a society, especially like Brazil, that is incredibly diverse, or a society like that of San Diego, that's incredibly diverse, where the choice of what language you use and the choice of what music you listen to and the choice of what clothing you wear very much depends on your comfort level with that language or that idea or that type of clothing, and also the context that you're going to be active in. And I think the ancient world allows us to understand that in a much more nuanced way, because we can see that process unfold over many decades or many centuries. Whereas in our contemporary environment, we haven't been thinking or talking in those terms for nearly as long as people in antiquity were. And so I think it's useful to give us a big frame of reference that spans a much larger chronological time than we're used to thinking about in modern contexts. I hope that helps, Pedro.
Vamos ver se ele vai responder.
Tem outras? Há outras aqui?
Let's check if there.
Let's check if you have another questions.
Okay.
Apparently, not yet. I have a question, Professor Edward. It doesn't have to do specifically what you addressed, because I'm currently working on Aristophanes comedy and Hippocratic medicine. But something that caught my attention was the status of Greek culture and Hellenism in general. So I would like to ask you, I would like to know, what was the general status of Greek language during the period you studied, during the Principate, and in the Roman perspective in general? Because when I turn to Aristophanic fragments, I perceive, and there is a whole scholar tradition that attests it, that Aristophanes was considered somewhat as a representative of this Attic Greek language, sometimes a conservative one, sometimes a pure Greek language. So I would like to know what was the general perspective on Greek language, because as Margot said, a lot of ancient Roman authors choose to write in Greek, right, instead of in ancient Latin. So in general, please, thank you.
No, I think that it's a wonderful question. And I think as you move from the Principate, the early Principate, into, say, the 2nd century, the level of comfort with Greek becomes very, very high. It's not always clear to me what they're reading. But somebody like Marcus Aurelius or Hadrian can choose what language they want to write in. Marcus chooses Greek. Hadrian also apparently chose Greek. But they were born in the West. Their natural language growing up was Latin. It was just a choice they made. And then similarly, in the 4th century, Ammianus Marcellinus grew up speaking probably Greek and or Syriac, but chose to write in Latin, and explains why he does this. So I think when you're talking about the 2nd through the 4th centuries, there are lots of people who have great comfort moving between the two languages. And this again becomes a question of choice, where if you want to write philosophy like Marcus is doing in the Meditations, Greek is just a better choice because the vocabulary is more nuanced, and so you can be more precise in what you're saying. In the same way that if you want to work in sort of philosophical terminology now, it's a lot better to write in German than English, because the vocabulary can be much more precise in German than in English. I think as you get into the 5th century, you begin to see this breaking down. So I think in the West, you have fewer people who have the ability to make that choice. And there's a sense that the ability to work in those languages has disappeared. So we know, like, I think Sidonius Apollinaris translates Life Apollonius of Tyana into Latin. Boethius in the 520s is famously able to translate Greek text into Latin. But what's interesting about the choices that Boethius makes is there's a sense that he does not believe that the ability to access these texts in Greek will exist anymore because of the way he chooses to take on that translation project. So at the same time that Boethius is doing this in the 520s, there's a translation project taking place in the Syriac world to transform the teaching of Aristotle for Syriac scholars and Syriac students. When they do this, they translate the commentaries, but the assumption is that the students can still read Aristotle in Greek. What Boethius does is he translates Aristotle, because the assumption is that whoever's reading this will not be able to read Aristotle in Greek anymore. And so in the Syriac world, there's an understanding that you will choose your ability, you will choose the language to work in. In the Latin world, for the same time in the 6th century, seems to be a realization that people are losing the ability to make to I think actually pretty well. In the Syriac world, what that translation project is doing is leading to we know that our that doctors will be able to access things like the Hippocratic. So it doesn't see the century in the West. I don't know that those ever line in the way with the to bring line the material. What we can imagine is in the material period, if you are a member of the elite, you will be expected, for a senator, you will be expected to have groups where be able to make a group appropriate. Continues for 100 years.
Professor, I'm so sorry. I was gonna interrupt you. It seems there is a problem maybe with your microphone. I don't know. We are listening. Yeah. Let's try it. Please say something now. Let's see.
Is this any?
Not so much. Please say something again so we can test it. We can try. No, yeah, it was all of a sudden we were listening to you perfectly.
Can you hear me better now?
Please say something again. I guess we do.
Is this any better? Okay. I think that I think whatever
Much better.
The
microphone. Now it's much better.
Yeah, sometimes it happens. We stopped listening to you around when you were talking about that Greek language might disappear in the author's perspective, Boetius, I believe.
Okay, yeah. So I think that what we can see is that for about 300 years, if you're a member of the Roman senatorial elite, there's definitely an assumption that you should be able to work across those two languages. And then that ability to choose the context where you're going to deploy the language, it evaporates pretty quickly. So senators in the later part of the 4th century still are believed to have that ability. Someone like a Praxiteles, who dies in the 380s, he translates Themistius. He writes Latin poetry. He also translates Greek philosophy. He governs Athens. The governor of Athens is traditionally in the 4th century a Western Roman senator who speaks Latin but also speaks Greek fluently. And by the time you get into the middle part of the 5th century, that is going away.
I see it. Yeah, it's really clear, this relationship. Thank you so much.
Pessoal, vocês têm mais alguma...
Professor Ivan.
Ivan
Ivan Esperança Rocha. So Ivan Esperança Rocha is a professor of ours at Unesp, and he has a question to Professor Edward. So he says, could you describe a little bit more about Plutarch's intention to use parallel lives to instill the role of philosophy in controlling passion?
So I think that what we're looking at with the parallel lives are Plutarch's attempts to isolate individuals who embody particular characteristics that are similar in both a Greek and Roman context. And so I think that the direct goal there is not necessarily to control passion so much as to present a study of various character traits and understand them in their fullest way so that you can see how they manifest in a positive way and how they manifest in a negative way. But the Greek and Roman examples work together to show this. So, you know, if you're looking at the structure of those things, what Plutarch does is he introduces the parallel life. He then gives you the Greek life. He gives you the Roman life. He then gives you a kind of comparison at the end. But the grouping of this is not around the details of the activities of the person. The grouping is around the characteristics that these people embody. So, you know, Caesar and Alexander the Great, it's a study of ambition and what ambition can mean when channeled in a positive way or a negative way, and how ambition can become destructive. And so the lessons that I think Plutarch is looking to deploy are lessons that consist of these historical exemplars that are both Greek and Roman. And the understanding that he wants you to see is you cannot understand whatever point he's making about virtue from just the Greek figure or just the Roman figure. You need both of them, and you need to study them together in the way that he's presented them together so that that character trait can then be brought, can then be considered in its entirety in this sort of concluding and wrap up of what he's doing, you know, when he finishes the parallel, the grouping or the joint study of those figures. So I think that when you put this together, you put the whole project together, what you have are a set of studies of individual character traits that are important for a Roman ruling class that hasn't before considered Roman history and Greek history in this particular way. You know, where the Greek and the Roman must work together for you to really achieve the fullest understanding of how that society should function. And so I think that, you know, I think that this is actually what he's trying to do with the parallel lives. It's also a project that he doesn't, you know, that he's doing in other works as well. It just isn't as neatly articulated as in the structuring of the parallel lives.
Rhea? Incredible, incredible.
Thank you, Edward. I think it's all the questions were wonderful, and your presentation was great presentation.
No, thank you.
Make us to think about
A new point of view.
Another research and another forms to think the Roman and the documents that your presentation show us. I thank you so much. We don't have any questions in the chat, and we can end our live. And thank you so much that you accepted to talk with us in our Congress. I hope to meet you in presential form in the future, and you are welcome when you want or when you can come to Brazil and visit our UNESCO. Thank you so much. I'm grateful for you accept us and talk with us. Margot?
We hope next time you come to Brazil. I suppose
I hope so.
Yes, I suppose you are going to like the interesting of our students and professors here in Asian history. We have a country. Many people here is interested in Asian history. Asian history is growing very much in Brazil. It's amazing.
Wonderful.
And we are sure you are going to like to come here and stay with us some days and with our students. Thank you very much for your brilliant lecture, and the subject is going to help us very much to guide our students and our research. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Ok. Agora, gostaria de falar mais alguma coisa, Andréa?
Edward, apologize me now. I need to speak in Portuguese to the people and to our students and all the team that organized our Congress. Okay, I'm sorry, but I need to talk in Portuguese now.
Sure.
Bom, Margot, gostaria de agradecer, né, todas as pessoas que fizeram com que o nosso 10º CIEAM acontecesse, agradecer a sua, né, participação presencial, Bárbara, e todas as pessoas.
Foi ótimo.
Assis, tivemos uma semana muito quente com calor humano, mas frio em nosso tempo. Edward, we have a cold week here in Brazil, but we have warm people in the places and our university and our meeting, and I think the weather cold, but I think was a warm time with people. Nós tivemos uma semana muito gostosa, muito calorosa, né? Tivemos uma semana de encontros, né, com reuniões, tivemos as pessoas que se dedicaram muito, muito, muito mesmo. A principal delas é o Abner. Sem a liderança do Abner, não teria acontecido esse CIEAM. Então, eu quero novamente deixar registrado que o Abner é o responsável por tudo que nós conseguimos fazer essa semana. Sem ele, o CIEAM, né, não teria acontecido da forma que nós tivemos. Como primeira experiência híbrida, né, nós tivemos uma semana de desafios com internet no campus, sem internet no campus, mas conseguimos passar por essa semana e eu acredito que nós tenhamos tido um grande sucesso no nosso 10º CIEAM. Margot, agradeço a sua parceria de sempre. Gostaria de agradecer, né, as pessoas e o nosso apoio, né, também é importante agradecer que tivemos apoio do programa de pós-graduação em História, na pessoa da professora Karina. Quero agradecer todo o apoio que tivemos em relação ao financiamento, né, de convidados. Também quero agradecer o Departamento de História, a Faculdade de Ciências e Letras e a todos os técnicos que nos auxiliam, aos motoristas que fizeram um ótimo trabalho e um trabalho muito carinhoso em buscar e levar, né, os nossos convidados, ao professor Ivan, que, né, se deslocou a São Paulo para poder atender, né, uma emergência e levar a professora Helene Bósia para voltar aos Estados Unidos e fazer o seu exame médico, a professora Helene Bósia, da Universidade da Flórida, ao professor Ed Watts, né, por nos aceitarem em enquanto interlocutores, para que nós pudéssemos enriquecer o nosso CIEAM. A todos os convidados que aceitaram e estiveram conosco, seja virtualmente, seja presencialmente, e a toda a equipe de alunos, né, de estudantes que geralmente, né, ficam escondidos, mas que sem eles nós não teríamos o nosso evento, né? E aqui também ao Pedro e ao Felipe, que nos apoiam nas questões técnicas, sem eles não teríamos essa possibilidade. O financiamento da FAPESP, né, foi importante para que nós pudéssemos também ter a organização do evento, receber, né, as pessoas, e essa parceria com o Geleir, né, Margot? Eu acho que o NEAM, Geleir, NEAM, né, cada vez mais próximos, e isso é fundamental. Então, eu gostaria de agradecer, né, a todas as pessoas que contribuíram com o 10º CIEAM. E, Margot, muito obrigada por você percorrer todo esse caminho na estrada e entrar agora conosco para participar do encerramento e auxiliar o professor Edward na nossa live de encerramento. Muito obrigada a todos e a todas.
Eu também gostaria de te agradecer muito pela calorosidade. Foi maravilhoso estar em Assis depois de um tempo pandêmico e estar com esses monitores maravilhosos, com o Abner. Também gostaria muito de agradecer ao Abner, ao Pedro, ao Felipe, ao Ivan, a você. Nossa, foi muito bom mesmo. A Renata, nossa, todo mundo que estava aí. E fechamos com chave de ouro, né? Vamos tirar um print. We would like to take a photo, Edward, please.
Sure.
To put in our Instagram. Yes.
We can take it. Can you take it from there as well, Andrea, please? Then we can match.
Okay. Okay.
Print, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me see.
I have a print, but Pedro.
Okay. Thank you. So, 1, 2, 3.
Já tirou. Pedro já tirou.
Okay, so I'm gonna take another one, ok? Eu vou tirar outro, tá? Tá,
ok,
peraí.
Pedro. O Pedro quer aparecer. Pedro,
Eu cliquei sem querer.
Não, por favor, fique na foto.
Não, então vai ele também.
Felipe.
Cadê o Abner?
O Abner não está no StreamYard now, agora. No, Abner not here.
Ok, so Pedro will be responsible.
Okay. In 3, I take a photo. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay. I not have words to describe how I feel.
We can.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We can stay in the StreamYard, but YouTube it's ending. Okay, we can stay here.
Okay.
Muito obrigada a todos que nos acompanham pelo YouTube, muito obrigada a todas as pessoas que estiveram presencialmente, e agora o próximo CIEAM será em Franca em 2025, não é isso? 2025, o próximo CIEAM em Franca. The next Congress, the next Congress is in 2025,
and we are going to invite you again to come here to Brazil in
Wonderful.
2025.
Well, I was telling Andrea that I have some from my university as well. I have some money, so I can help with that too.
Okay.
Very good.
It's organized. You are invited now.
And we are waiting the results of our project, and I'm going to enter in contact with you if the project is approved, okay?
Wonderful.
Okay,
Yes.
Pedro, você pode encerrar o YouTube, por favor?